welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. I'm your host, Richie Billing, and today we've got another packed episode. We're taking a detailed look at medieval battles with our resident historian, Aidan Mattis, and we'll be chatting all things folklore with Janina, Arndt and Lucy Atkinson from the Faith Fellows podcast. I've also got a bunch of calls for submissions for you, and we've also got some interesting community shout-outs, plus a review of a very cool new book cover tool I think you're going to love. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder to please give us a subscribe or a follow. If you enjoy listening, please also consider leaving us a quick review and sharing it with anyone you think may be interested. It really does mean an awful lot and helps us out massively. If you'd like to join our community, as well as get access to some books on writing fantasy and some fantasy writing classes, head over to our Patreon page. The link for that is in the description. And now I think it's time to don our helmets, pick up our swords and shields, and dive back in time for a look at medieval warfare with Aidan Mattis. Hello and welcome to another segment of our medieval history exploration, really, and just the point of these little segments is just to give you ideas, inspiration, and dispel some of the myths, particularly when it comes to certain aspects of medieval life. So in previous episodes, we've looked at diseases, we've looked at archery, which is sort of what we're going to talk about today, and we've also looked at day-to-day life during the medieval era. And today we're going to talk about battles and warfare, which is one of my favourite subjects. And I'm thrilled to be joined by our resident historian, Mr. Aidan Mattis from the Law Lodge podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Yeah, it's great to have you back to share your wisdom. And I understand this is a favourite topic of yours as well.
Oh, yes. One of my absolute favourites.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I've been reading a lot of historical fiction lately, and particularly to do with the Punic Wars and also the Greek-Persian Wars. I love that.
Yeah. Oh, the Greco-Persian Wars.
So we can talk a lot about this. But what are we going to talk? We're going to focus on more the medieval period.
Yeah.
Since that focuses as well, that features in fantasy more than most. So,
yes.
Warfare, I thought it'd be a good idea, because I think this is where fantasy writers go wrong, to basically try and get as deep into the sort of mindset of somebody in that era going to war. So I'm thinking we've just been marching for a few days, got all our stuff on our shoulders, armour, all that. We've spoken about how heavy armour is and stuff like that. So pick it up from here. Tell us what we're going to be going through.
Yeah, so if you're on the eve of battle, generally by the medieval period, you were at the point where battles were a somewhat agreed upon event.
Yeah.
As you got later and later into the Middle Ages, that became more and more of a thing. You would actually go and meet and send emissaries and say, all right, we're going to fight here at this time. Earlier on in the Middle Ages, you were looking at a lot more of trying to outmaneuver the enemy, and oftentimes you would have two armies circle each other for days, even weeks, trying to find the best position and forcing the other into attacking, because you wanted to be on the defense, unless you had basically overwhelming force. But if you are, to put yourself in the mindset of your average, probably your average knight, because they were doing the majority of the fighting, the majority of the intense fighting, but you would also have, pikemen and bowmen who would be involved. But your average, let's say man at arms, let's say somebody who's a trained soldier, but they're not of the noble class. You're going to be probably dressed when you get dressed for battle, you're going to get up in the morning. If you're not on horseback, then you're going to have a much lighter meal. But if you're on horseback, you're probably going to be eating about a pound of beef for breakfast. Early in the Middle Ages, you'd have a lot of people also drink before battle. Not enough to get drunk, but enough to be bold, enough to get that, liquid courage. Yeah, exactly. Get you moving and you pumped, and a little bit more dulled to pain. But you'd have people who would often, take a few swigs of mead before battle, and, that would get them a little bit more ready to go, so to speak. But if you're getting into later period, you're a man at arms, you're getting ready to go into battle, you're probably wearing chainmail over a gambesson or over leather, depending on what region you're from. And chainmail, of course, each link in a chainmail shirt is usually connected to 5 other links, and that's what makes it so strong, is that all of the metal is conjoined to so much other metal. The primary weakness of chainmail is stabbing or blunt force. So if you are in the later Middle Ages, you're probably going to be armed with a sword or a spear. If you're of the man-at-arms type, the sword became the more dominant weapon later, but earlier on, the spear was always the most common weapon on a medieval battlefield. So if you were going to battle, you were most likely armed with a spear, a sidearm, which would be either a sword or an axe, maybe a dagger, and you would be wearing usually whatever the moderate armor of the day was. So in the late Middle Ages, that would be chainmail, maybe a breastplate, maybe some pauldrons. But the high Middle Ages, you're looking at chainmail or a very thick leather gambesson armor piece. Yeah. And then early Middle Ages, you're looking at like leather jerkins and not gambesons. Gambesons weren't really in fashion yet, but and maybe like a simple not chainmail, not like technically what chainmail is that 5-link type of shirt. Yeah. But they would have a type of mail that was usually less interlinked. It might be like 2 or 3 links rather than 5. And that's what was used by, for example, the Romans had a sort of chainmail that was just less effective. So you'd be wearing that if you were earlier on. And for a helmet, almost everybody who fought in the Middle Ages wore a helmet. If you were a peasant, you probably didn't, but you also weren't really doing much fighting, much like close quarters, sword or shield. If you were a peasant, you were probably using a spear, and you were probably at the back of the line. So if you're one of the professional soldiers, if you're one of the professional soldiers, you've got a helmet. Early Middle Ages might be a leather helm. Later, you're going to get those kind of taller helmets with the nose guards and everything. Viking helmets, obviously, there's this misconception they had horns. Probably didn't. And you're looking at probably 20 to 30 pounds all told of armor total. Not nearly. People seem to think that, a medieval suit of armor weighed 50 or 60 pounds. Didn't. What soldiers carry into battle today is far heavier than what you were carrying into battle as a medieval soldier. Even as a knight, you were wearing, 30, 40 pounds of gear max, because back then you had to actually be able to move. And so you're getting ready for battle. You've got probably a shield. In the early Middle Ages, you would have been looking at a large round shield that would have had a boss in the center, and this is where your hand would go. Early medieval shields were usually, you'd have like a leather strap that went across right here, and then your hand would grip a handle in the center. And that boss could be used both as obviously defensive, but also as an offensive punching weapon. And so the primary way that you were going to line up as you were getting ready to go into battle was early Middle Ages. You're looking at a shield wall, and that would involve overlapping those shields against one another, much like a Greek phalanx. And then so as you get into the high Middle Ages, you're looking at the rise of the kite shield as being in vogue, which is longer. It's a little bit narrower, and it would essentially sit, if you were a mounted soldier, your arm would actually go all the way through the straps. So it would be strapped to your arm, not to your hand. And then that would leave your left hand free to use the reins while still protecting you with your shield on this side. So you would be left hand on the reins, shield right here. And that way, if somebody tried to strike at you from your weak side, they're probably not going to hit you. They're going to hit your shield. Still might hurt, because you got to remember, all of this is hand-to-hand. Like the primary method of killing someone was blunt force trauma. So even if you were wearing chainmail and if somebody hit you in the side with an axe, even if it didn't penetrate, it still could break some ribs. So the primary thing you're doing here is you're trying to blunt force your way through, which is why axes and clubs remained popular for so long, is because they would just crush through armor and shields. And then if you're looking at the high Middle Ages, the shields actually get dropped and ditched. Now, this is not, it really gets down to a point of what was the most effective method of combat. So for example, with the English army, their strategy was to use the range of their longbows to just make sure that they could pepper the enemy before they got close. Yeah. And then they wanted to unhorse whoever they were fighting against, so they would use their pikemen. Now, the English army was one of the more versatile ones because they had to deal with fighting the Welsh, Scots, and Irish, who fought in a very different manner from the French. Yeah. So when the English were fighting the Scots, Irish, and Welsh, they would often use more French battle tactics, heavy horsemen, lots of archery. And then when they were facing the French, they would use more Scottish battle tactics, pikes and skirmishers. And that was kind of how it went. The main vehicle of medieval combat outside of England was the mounted knight. This was Spain, France, Germany, not Scandinavia, but Spain, France, Germany, and Italy. You're looking at mounted knights, and you would use that masked mounted charge, and that was what would succeed most often, was whoever had the better knights. But in the later Middle Ages, that's when it kind of got into, oh, well, you can stop a lot of knights with a lot of pikemen. And people starting to realize cheaper might be better for warfare. But yeah, so if back to we're in the mindset of, being a man at arms. So you got probably your leather or steel helmet, probably got some rings hanging down here. It's heavy, but you're used to that. You march with all of this gear on your back as it is. You're going to go into a battle line. So you've got everybody to your sides. If you're early medieval period, shield wall. If you are high Middle Ages, you're looking at probably still a battle line, but not the same type of overlapped shields kind of thing, because you're going to be following the knights in for the charge. And once those lines clash, you're going to be following in your knights and your shock infantry to start dealing the blows. And then in the late Middle Ages, you're getting more of the pike warfare. So you're going to be lining up next to everybody. Probably the front rank might have shields, but it's just going to be them. And then after that, everybody's going to have their pike and probably a sidearm, an axe, sword. You're getting into the period of professional armies. So everybody's been more uniformly equipped. And that's the point which, from a psychological standpoint, what these people were looking at was the very real possibility that they might die. If you talk to a lot of modern soldiers, a lot of the combat they go into is very lopsided in terms of equipment, in terms of skill, in terms of numbers. So the American and British military, most of the time that they get into engagements nowadays, they have the overwhelming advantage. It's very unlikely that they're going to die in combat. Obviously, people still die, but it's not nearly the very real possibility that you will, you're looking across the field at an army that is as equipped as yours most of the time. And it's going to be not a matter of your individual skill, but the tactical acumen of your general that is driving the success of your battle that day. And the earlier you go in the Middle Ages, the less that becomes true. The earlier you go, the more it becomes about individual heroics. And interestingly, the earlier you go, the more it becomes about individual heroics, the less casualties armies take. So medieval battles that occurred, between 500 and 1,000, you'd be looking at, in a large battle, a couple thousand soldiers on each side. For an army to be 10,000 men was absurd. That was a ridiculous number of soldiers in the early Middle Ages during the Viking Age. When you hear stories about armies of 25,000 men marching to war, that's a lot of soldiers. Consider that, for example, in the poem Igadothin by Aidan, which tells the story of a battle between the Celts, the Brythonic Celts of Strathclyde and Altclut and the northern kingdoms of the Cymry against the Anglo-Saxons. They're talking about 600 warriors going off to face the Saxons. They're saying they're outnumbered, but 600 men is a lot of men, and these are all very talented champions that are going to war. That's a large army for the year 600 AD. Yeah. 300 men. It's 300 men. It's 600 AD. And they all die. That's the gist of the story, is everyone died but Anirin. And Anirin was supposedly the brother of Gildas, who was the guy who wrote The Ruin of Britain, one of these, great historians. And then you go back further, you got Bede, and, a little bit forward in time, you got Nennius, some of these great Celtic historians. But so you go from, 300 men being a large force, and 300 casualties being devastating to an entire culture, to, in the late Middle Ages, you're still not seeing, the mass casualties of like the 30 Years' War, but you're seeing, hundreds of people dead, thousands wounded. Could happen. You're not going to see, there are battles from the 30 Years' War where you had thousands of men on both sides die. That doesn't happen at all during the Middle Ages, and that's one of those things that gets caught up in a lot of fantasy. And Peter Jackson is guilty of it with his Lord of the Rings adaptation. And that is not to say that Tolkien does not give him the material for it, but Peter Jackson's version of things is you've got this massive army of cavalry charging into tens of thousands of orcs and just totally running straight through them. And when you're thinking about like orcs who are they're not mindless, but they're a lot less, self-determining than, for example, the Rohirrim are in Lord of the Rings. But, Peter Jackson has them turn around. And obviously the way this goes in the books versus the way this goes in the movies is different. But in the movies, which I'm sure everybody's seen, they turn around and there's the Oliphants, there's the Mumakil behind them. And you see just hundreds of these horsemen charge in and just get torn apart by the Mumakil. That would not happen in a medieval battle, especially to a warrior culture like that of the Rohirrim. You're going to have, if you have an army of 3,000 men and you, in the space of 5 minutes, lose 300, you're turning and leaving. You're saying, bye, this is over, day's done, we lost. Like, there are examples of battles where one side that was hundreds of men strong lost 30 men and considered it a catastrophic failure. Your average casualty count in terms of deaths and wounded would be like 8 to 15 men in your average medieval skirmish. Your average numbers on both sides would be maybe in the few hundreds. And then as you get into the later period and the larger battles of like the 100 Years' War, you're then looking at, 15, 20,000 men on each side. So that's like the grand scale that you see in a lot of fantasy and historical fiction is just that. It's fantasy. But that's part of what makes fantasy fun, is you take this period of history and you're like, okay, what if we just grew the numbers by 1,000% and added dragons and a wizard. It makes it it's a fun way to think about things. And of course the primary difference, I like it's put this way by Orson Scott Card. The primary difference between fantasy and sci-fi is trees. Fantasy has trees, sci-fi has metal. He says that's the biggest difference between the two, and I'm inclined to agree with him. Regardless of your political affiliations, you should go and watch Ben Shapiro's Sunday special with Orson Scott Card. It's almost entirely apolitical. He pretty much just talks about like fantasy and sci-fi literature the entire time. It's a fascinating little thing. And this is the guy, very prolific fantasy and science fiction author, Orson Scott Card. Ender's Game and all of those books are him. They're phenomenal. Anybody who hasn't read them absolutely should. It's a masterclass in fantasy writing. I think he's without a doubt a better author than like George R. R. Martin in terms of competing for that title of best contemporary fantasy author. I think Orson Scott Card is far and away better than George R. R. Martin is. I like George R. R. Martin's work, I do, but I think it pales in comparison to like the Ender's Shadow series and the political drama that goes on there. Yeah. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at here is what the casualty numbers are much lower. So the chance, like if you watch Braveheart, for example, you'll see like both sides will just lose hundreds and hundreds of men, and Mel Gibson alone is killing 15 Englishmen. That just wouldn't happen. That you would never have that kind of thing. Where you do see it, for example, is some of like Nennius's accounts of King Arthur's battles, where he's like, "Oh, Archer slew 900 men by his own hand at the Battle of Mons Baden." Probably not.
Yeah.
Max numbers on both sides in a battle that occurred in like 512 AD, few hundred on each side. The number of mercenaries that even came to Britain from Saxony was probably in the low thousands, if in the high hundreds. The average size of an early medieval army was a few hundred men. It was still very much going based on the comitatenses, the comitatus structure of having a captain, and then that captain is leading 15 to 50 men who trust him, and he's their leader, which eventually gives way to the feudal system. But the comitatus structure of a leader and his band of followers is prevalent in Germanic and Celtic history from beyond what we actually have any written record of. Yeah. But that's kind of you see a good mix of that in fantasy, where you have your heroic character and then their band of loyal followers, but then also you get these giant set piece battles with a more feudal structure of generals and lords who command different segments of the army and whatnot. So that would be probably the last thing that I would say is really important to put yourself in the mindset of, is as a medieval man-at-arms, your allegiance is not to king and country.
Yeah.
That's a much later idea. Your allegiance is to your direct feudal lord. So if you are one of 5 men-at-arms brought by a minor unlanded knight, you're a knight's squire, your allegiance is to that knight. Yeah. So if that knight changes sides, you're expected to change sides, which obviously very inconvenient, but that's the way the feudal system works, is if your leader changes sides or he decides to withdraw from the battle, you follow him. And it works the same for him. If you're a very prestigious knight and you're known for your loyalty and your strength and all of that, and your feudal lord decides to go to the other side, if you don't do that, you risk losing everything, even if you stay on the right side of the battle.
Yeah.
Even if you stay with your side's king and your lord defects, you might still lose everything, because the king is going to take all of that lord's land away and give it to another lord who might not take you on. So you got to remember that structure exists as well, which is, adds to the drama.
Yeah.
That is one of the other things is, to go back to the Lord of the Rings, you have this whole Aragorn being the rightful king of Gondor. Sure. But say that you were to take Lord of the Rings and put it in a realistic context, which I would never suggest doing, because that's when you get comments like, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Thanks, George. Which just, it's not the point of the story.
Yeah.
But if Aragorn, say that we get past the Battle of the Black Gate and the ring is destroyed and Aragorn assumes the kingship of Gondor. Well, but what about the Lord of Anfalis, who has decided that, he's loyal to the steward. He's loyal to the house of Ecthelion and not the house of Isildur. Well, he might decide to raise his banner in rebellion and try and restore Faramir as the rightful steward of Gondor, or he might decide to secede entirely and form his own kingdom. That's something that would happen in medieval society. If your country's royalty, if your country's monarchy changed families, there was a 100% chance someone was going to rebel.
Yeah.
There is not a single peaceful transition of power between two noble houses. Between father and son, sure. Between two noble houses, not a single time in European medieval history did that go well.
Yeah.
Somebody always had a bone to pick. Somebody always had a problem with it, and they made a point of telling you about it.
Always fighting, always war.
Exactly. And that is a very European thing. That's the other thing, is that is as old as Europe itself. So there's, And you do see it in other countries, but that specific, the feudal system and all of that, that's very European. That is very much a medieval and ancient European structural thing that is just this one of these quirks of a region's history. Africa has its own quirks, and as do the Middle East and Asia and North America and South America. That's one of Europe's, is just this very, very intricate and legalized form of warfare that they all follow. Like society, just often you look at history and you're like, how is it that Europeans managed to do what they did in terms of the colonial empires and whatnot? It is because Europeans for 2,000 years have been living their lives are based around war.
Yeah,
with society itself in Europe since arguably the Punic Wars, probably I would say, society in Europe has had the primary function of being protection from other societies.
Yeah.
The primary binding factor of any nation, any country was, I need to be with these people, because if I don't stick with these people, those people are going to kill me. And that's how Europe developed for 2,000, 3,000 years. Say what you will about how it went, but it's as a result, the world is the way it is. But it's incredibly interesting to study, and I think it makes for some fascinating history and some, obviously some of what I think is the best literature ever written is in the historical fiction and fantasy genres that are based upon this tradition of telling the tales of heroic warriors and making those the people that we look up to. Our King Arthurs, our Robin Hoods, our Aragorns. Those characters who are based around this model of the European folk hero.
I hope you've learned something new there, everybody. And Aidan, thank you so much for taking the time to share that wisdom with us.
Of course.
If anyone wants to find out more, where can we find you?
You can find me at the War Lodge on YouTube, as well as the Aidan Mattis on pretty much everything else. And I am both on Instagram, actually. I've got both those pages.
Yeah, follow everything because your life's going to be better for it. Aidan, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And we'll welcome you back soon.
Thank you for having me.
A big thank you to Aidan. The man is a walking history book, I swear it. I hope you've learned something new. I learn something new every time I chat to Aidan, so I really do love having him on, and I hope you do too. And I hope it's given you some ideas for your own stories that you can use and hopefully go on and write a bestseller. Aidan will be back to share his wisdom on a few very interesting topics to do with medieval period, and that is going to come in the next few episodes. So be sure to subscribe and follow us, and even join our mailing list as well. You won't miss an episode that way. Got a few calls for submissions to share with you now. I'm going through this process myself at the moment with a short story. So I feel your despair at the long delays between acknowledgements or getting a response. It's pretty tedious, but there are a few publishers that have popped onto my radar in my search. And as always, I think you should check every publisher out before you submit, just to make sure that they're the best fit possible for your story. So I've got 5 to share with you now. And first up is Welkin Magazine, which is a magazine of the fantastic, and it's looking for submissions for the Book of Idle Tales, which is a book of 1,500 words, flash fiction stories. So head over to welkinmag.com to find out more about that one. US magazine Dark Elements is looking for horror, mystery, dark fantasy, dark science fiction and thrillers, and not just short stories for this one, but poetry, flash fiction, and novel excerpts too. I'm sure they're also looking for artwork, so if you dabble in that as well, just head over to darkelements.us to find out more. And sticking with the dark theme, the Dark Magazine is looking for horror and dark fantasy stories between 2,000 and 6,000 words long, and they also pay 6 cents a word for this one, so it's a real excellent paying market. Go to thedarkmagazine.com to learn more. Dragon Soul Press has got a mountain of anthologies that they're looking for submissions for. I think they're publishing one every month next year. And the next one that they're currently looking for closes on the 31st of December. It's called Rogue Tales, and they're seeking sexy fairy tales. That's their description, not mine. And they're looking for stories between 5,000 and 20,000 words long. So head over to dragonsoulpress.com to find out more. And lastly, Pride Book Cafe is looking for submissions for an upcoming anthology called From the Ashes, an anthology of elemental urban fantasy. And this anthology is helping raise money for burn survivors. So it's for absolutely fantastic cause. And they also pay 8 cents a word up to the first 1,000 words. And then after that, it's 1 cent up to 39,999 words. So if you've got a novel excerpt that you'd like to get published, this is a good place for that. Just head to Pride Book Cafe to learn more. So good luck with the submissions. And if you do find success, please share the good news with us at the Fantasy Writers Toolshed at gmail.com. And why not join our writing communities as well? We're very active on Discord and Facebook, and we always share different calls for submissions, and people help each other get the stories polished for submissions too. So it's a great place to collaborate like that. Just follow the link in the description to learn more. Now, before I move on to book cover tool news, I've got a few community shout-outs to share with you. First, I just wanted to say a huge congratulations to Misha Herwin, who's co-wrote a book with Maddie Harisis to raise funds for Blood Cancer UK in memory of Posey Miller, Misha's daughter and Maddie's niece. This is for an absolutely fantastic cause, and they're aiming to sell 500 copies of The Awesome Adventures of Poppy and Amelia before Christmas. So please head on over to Amazon. I've got my copy, and share it with anyone you think may be interested too. Congratulations to Joan Ramirez on the release of her book, The Right Rules, which is available on Amazon.com. It is a handbook for English as a second language and particularly targeted at financial, medical, and technical professionals. Well done to David Donaghy on the publication of his short story, The Changeling, which you can find in Improbable Press's Dark Chair, Cryptids Emerging Anthology, which sounds very interesting indeed. I'll be checking that one out. Congrats to Joe Lewis on the upcoming release of his crime thriller, Blaze In, Blaze Out. It's had some fantastic reviews, so keep an eye out for that one and check out Black Rose Writing for more. Congratulations to BK Bass on the release of his post-apocalyptic novel, What Once Was Home, available on Amazon. It looks very cool indeed, and I've added this to my to-be-read pile. Well done to Josephine Winter on the release of Book 3 in the K1174 series, which is also available on Amazon. And this looks like BK's book, a very intriguing one. Congratulations to John B. Rosenman on the release of his new book, Starfighter Chronicles. This is described as 800 pages of non-stop sci-fi adventure, and it's had some really excellent reviews, which you can check out on Amazon. Congratulations to Craig Deegan on the release of the second book in the Cracklock series, The Lost and the Departed. Find out all about it on thecracklocksaga.com. A shout out to Liverpool author Paul McDermott, who will be down at the Christmas market at the Liverpool Irish Centre on Sunday, the 19th of December, selling copies of his various books. And I'm going to be there too, selling a few of my own books. So if you're in Liverpool or the area and you'd like to come down and say hello, get a few copies, signed copies of books and whatnot, I'll probably be down there from about 1 till 3 or 4. Congratulations to Peter Thompson on the release of The Forked Path, which is the third tale of the Wild series. And you can check that one out on Amazon. Big congratulations to Anne Peters on her new book, The Dragon Who Would Be King, a young adult fantasy adventure, which you can get through Amazon. Congrats to S. Tillman Hawthorne on the release of a very interesting collection of novelettes, short stories, flash fiction, and poems. It's called Imagination, Come Dream With Me, and it's available on Amazon. Congratulations to Laverne Spencer McCarthy on her successes for 2021 with an incredible 2 books published, 9 short stories, and 48 poems. That's fantastic. Really well done. Big well done to Catherine Gallant on securing a spot on the Writer to Write All mentorship program provided by the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. It sounds very interesting indeed. Please let it know how it goes. And lastly, congrats to Alex Greenwood, who's received a fantastic review of his new book, Pilot's Faith, from Kirkus Reviews, which is one of the biggest book reviewers on the internet. So really well done. congratulations again to everybody there. And if you have any news that you'd like to share, we've got the next episode coming up and the next newsletter going out on the same day, which is on the 28th of December. Just email the details to the fantasywriterstoolshed@gmail.com. Now, if you've been on social media of late, you may have seen some eye-catching book covers being shared. And this is all because a new app for iPhone and Android has come out called Wombo Dream, and it utilizes artificial intelligence to quickly generate book covers or pieces of artwork simply by using keyword tags and different styles that you can choose from. And there's a range of different artistic styles. So you've got dark fantasy, general fantasy, pastel, mystical, synth, steampunk is another one, I think. You literally just enter the keyword. So I've been using one for my upcoming book on worldbuilding. So I've been looking for map. And in just a few seconds, you can get a free, really, really eye-catching. It's impressive, the quality, especially with it being free. So I've been playing around with it. A lot of people on social media and in our writing group have been playing around with it too. I sometimes think that the designs can be a bit abstract. And if you're trying to get clear images of different things, then you might be a bit disappointed. But there is a way of doing it because I have seen some pretty amazing examples. So the trick is just to keep experimenting with keywords, use broad keywords, use really specific keywords, and play around with the different styles. Given the quality of it and the fact it's free, I think you'll be pretty blown away. I mean, book covers can cost starting £50-60 for a pretty basic one. So if you're looking for something to use for like a book funnel, the cover for a book funnel, for example, for a short story, this is something really worth looking at. I mean, you don't get a finished copy. You've got to take that image and then add a book title, author name. If you wanted to make it into a paperback, you'd have to do a spine and a back cover as well. So use things like Photoshop or Canva to help you with that, I'd say. So yeah, check it out and please share some of your own examples. Email them in. The email address is in the description, or you can join our group and share them in there too. Now, if you enjoy a fantasy story, then I'm sure you're also prone to a folk tale too. These weird and wonderful stories are in fact inherently associated with the fantasy genre so much that fantasy essentially spawned from it. And not only do folk tales inspire fantasy novels and fantasy stories, they can also give us ideas for things that we can include as part of our world building. And these little details, these little stories, I find really do help make our worlds feel alive. These are the things that readers seem to love more than anything else if you go by book reviews. So I wanted to invite the fantastic Lucy Atkinson and Janina Arndt back from the Faith Fellows podcast for an in-depth look at all things folklore. Hello and welcome to another dose of folklore and mythology. And I'm again delighted to be joined by Janina Arndt and Lucy Atkinson from the Faith Fellows podcast. Please go and check out their show if you're into ghost stories, myths and fairy folk. It's the best place to get a hearty dose of that. Janina and Lucy, how are you doing today?
We're doing good. We're excited to be here.
Oh, nice one. And today we're going to talk about folklore, just more generally. We touched a bit about it in a previous episode, but I just want to get into what folklore actually is and how you sort of use it as inspiration for our fantasy stories and how we create our own as well, if we're going down that route for our novels or short stories. So who wants to kick it off then? What is folklore exactly?
It looks like you wants me to do that, so I'll try my best. I think that in basic terms, folklore is myth and stories that are passed down orally through a community. So what characterizes it, I think, is the fact that it's passed down by word of mouth.
Yeah. And I suppose if that's the way that information's being sort of communicated, these stories are going to change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much when you find different collections of tales, you can very much tell what era they were collected in, and some of them have variants where suddenly cottages and townhouses and society play a role, whereas other more original things have to do more with nature and kings and queens in general. So they become more specific, I think, as time goes on.
Yeah. So to get into some examples, then, what are some of your favourite folk stories?
I mean, favourite is hard because I love all folk stories. I love them all. I think the one that's closest to me, both in actual distance and in kind of time, I guess, because I heard it probably first, is the Pickle Parson of Setchfield in the northeast, which is essentially a kind of horrific ghost story that revolves around a parson and his wife who live in Setchfield. And he's a very well-liked guy. Everyone loves him. Everyone's really happy to see him. But he unfortunately dies a couple of days before the townspeople are due to pay him their tithes. So to continue to collect that money, his wife is like, okay, I need this money. I'm just going to sit him and prop him up at the window, and get him to and make him look like he's, alive. Yeah. And then I'll go downstairs and I'll collect the money myself and I'll just tell people the parson's ill. And she does that once, and then in some variations of the tale, she does that and she's like, oh, well, this is a great system. We'll just keep doing this. So she pickles his body and continues to do that until she gets found out. And the thought of it is that he still walks around the parish because he's so angry as a man of God and a good man that his wife tricked all these people of the town.
Yeah, because he could go into pickle body for so long. Is there any idea how long she kept it going for?
I think it was only like 2 or 3 collections of the rent. 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, imagine the smell.
Yeah.
Imagine just looking up at the window as well and just his arm falls off or something. Yeah. What about you, Janina? Have you got any favourite folk tales?
So I'm very much into the dragons now. So up in the northeast, there are a lot of dragons. Very, again, more of the Germanic variety worms. We've got the lambton worm, we've got the sockburn worm. Then we've got one in Whitby. So yeah, it's very much a worm land up here, which is what I called my novel that I'm currently writing. Yeah, I guess, the lambton worm is so popular, and every time that I tell someone, the lambton worm's in my book, they go, oh my God, the lambton worm. I just didn't expect that to be so popular still, which is probably, would you agree, Lucy, that's probably also due to the song?
Yeah, it's 100% due to the song. We love that song up here.
Are you going to sing the song?
Oh God. It's in like old school Geordie.
Yeah.
Can you give us a line?
Wish lad, hold your gobs. That's
I'll tell you all an apple story. That's the one.
So what is the tale of the lambton worm?
So the lambton worm is coiled around either Worm Hill by Fatfield or Penshaw Hill, which is where the Penshaw Monument is. And in the song it's Penshaw Hill, but I think people figured out from the lore that it might have been more likely Worm Hill. Anyway, they're very you can sort of see one hill from the other hill. It's not a big distance. And so there's Sir John Lambton, who's our hero in this tale, and he is he does a few blasphemous things on a Sunday, like going fishing, and then he accidentally fishes out a worm, a creature of the devil, and throws it into a well, and there the worm grows and grows, and then spreads terror through the land by eating all the cattle and such like. And Lambton goes back and he goes on to crusades, and then he comes back and then he feels like, I have to clean up this mess, this is my fault. So he tries to slay the lambton worm. There we've got another witch involved, witch or wise woman, different names and different stories, who tells him that he should put on armour with like spearheads on it, so that the worm can wrap itself around him and thereby sort of slice itself up. Yeah. And that is how he defeats the worm. Interestingly, the stories like this, having a Sir John Lambton defeat the worm, very much were propaganda for the local gentry, the local so, you know, the local nobility to say we are descendants of a dragon slayer.
Yeah.
You know, be respectful to us. And so I think that's, you know, I think it's fascinating. It's also a bit terrifying, but a lot of the folklore that is around, you know, it has also got some kind of message behind it like that, especially, you know, in medieval tales. And that's where also like coats of arms come from and such like. So yeah, a very, very interesting story up here.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you make as well. A lot of folk tales come about from either someone trying to make you do or believe one thing, or playing upon your fears to get you to avoid doing other things. So we always remember like stories of like, don't go in the forest at night because such and such exists.
Yeah.
So like, is this how the sort of folk tales were used throughout history, really, to dissuade children from straying too far from the home? Or
some of them certainly, yeah. Others, you know, to propagate nobility. You know, I think a lot of them have the purpose of keeping world order, you know, just keeping the system in place as it is. And through that, like, and that's also what changes the folk tales, because, you know, that's how suddenly dragons, you know, enter the Bible as the sort of evil creature. Suddenly you've got the snake in the Garden of Eden, and then, you know, suddenly they're all not just, you know, a mighty foe or something, or some monstrous creature, but suddenly they're the devil, you know. So it's very, very interesting how they are utilized, and then, you know, still keep coming up though in all the stories.
Yeah, I think what's interesting as well is how folk tales, so I suppose that it sort of works like the media now, like newspapers, because back then we didn't have like newspapers, did these, obviously. So a lot of it was word of mouth stories. And I always think like the witch trials. I know, Lucy, you love history of witches. So how were folk tales used to sort of stir people up against witches and to sort of push this agenda of attacking women, essentially?
Yeah, folktales come up surprisingly often in the witch trials, which I think I wasn't expecting. I thought these would be two kind of separate interests, but particularly there's a massive slew of witch trials in Scotland that they call the panics, and there, because Scotland at that time is such a place of folk belief, and the folk belief doesn't necessarily align with what the kings and queens of Scotland want. It becomes this kind of systematic stamping out of folk belief, particularly fairy belief. There's one great tale of a woman, I believe, called Isabel Watson, or some variation of that. And she gets accused of witchcraft, and she admits to doing something. She admits to what she's accused of, but she says she's not a witch. She gets accused of infanticide, of harming her children. And she says, yeah, I did do that. I left I left one child out in the woods and I burnt another one on the fire. But I did it because I met with the Fae King and he told me to do it. So it's nothing to do with the devil and being a witch. It's to do with what the Fae want from me. That's what the fairies want. And so that's that kind of like folk belief coming in. Of course, she still gets hung for witchcraft, but, you know, it's an entirely different confession than the one they wanted from her.
Yeah. And yeah, it just goes to show like how things can be manipulated, and we like to think that, I don't know, we've got all this information accessible to us nowadays, but I think it still is easy to manipulate mass populations. And back then it was just easier to do it, to stir people up, to play upon the fears, divide. It's just like saying now, is it dividing populations and turning them against each other. And if it's like playing on the fears of witchcraft, for example, it's just a way of doing so, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you see folklore portrayed in the fantasy genre then, when it comes to the writing side of things?
I would challenge a person to find any culture anywhere in the world where folklore hasn't played an important part on the history of that culture. Everyone has folk stories, everyone, everywhere. And so when you're creating a fantasy world, that's something that you have to pay in mind. You don't just have to be like, okay, what do these people eat? What do these people do? What do they wear? You also have to be like, what do these people believe?
Yeah.
And whether it's true or not.
I think that helps you really get into, if you're developing characters and trying to make a world immersive, just showing that even secondary characters have their own lives, that you can see their fears, what motivates them to do things. That just makes it such an immersive story and a more lifelike world.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's it's so nice for people to recognize characters that are modeled on characters that they grew up with. Like, if you've got retelling or adaptations of Grimm's fairy tales, like it's a popular thing to do, because people will then recognize them and relate to them in a different way and see that they're still relevant.
Yeah. Have you got any favorite books, or have you used it in any of your own writing? Any sort of folklore that you've come across? Have you tried to implement that yourself, or you've seen any good examples of it?
Yeah, I'm currently writing a novel, as I said, Wormland, which is very much centered around a lot of northeastern folklore that we've got going up here. So the lambton worm does appear in it very much in person. It's also, this one it's from the perspective of a dragon, so very a little bit of a different take. So as from the folklore itself rather than humans coming in contact with it. So the dragon's the hero and the human is the sidekick. Just don't tell the human. So yeah, we've got the sidekick is a druid child who obviously then again has like a different belief system from the dragon, who was very much trying to be a good dragon, like her grandmother Margaret taught her, as in being a little bit evil every day sort of thing. But what I sort of really enjoyed doing was like giving them a bit of a journey through this part of the country and having them pass different creatures. Like, they meet fairies in Stanhope, which is, one of the tales that's around here, the Stanhope fairies, who require like 3 things to be found to let whoever they abducted go, or with a riddle and all that. There's the venerable Bede who pops up, and there are folk tales about him as well, which is interesting. And so I really enjoyed putting in all these different creatures and giving them their own voices and making them characters, rather than just having them appear and seeing how the human goes through it and solves the riddle of the fairies and then gets their daughter back, but very much coming into contact and seeing what the fairies want. So yeah, I find that so interesting to explore the different sides of all the creatures.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And what about you, Lucy? Have you implemented any sort of folk tales in your stories?
Yeah, I'm working in historical fiction at the minute, so not quite fantasy, but it has fantasy elements, definitely. And because I'm working on a novel about the Newcastle witch trials, that folk belief is so important. Because it informs so much of that tension between the kind of popular religion and the pagan religion that still has a hold in Newcastle. There's a lot of like folk healing and that kind of thing. How certain wise women would have known different routes to cure different illnesses, and different little, there's lots of little spells that go on and rituals in old school witchcraft. So that's kind of where I'm using it.
That's amazing. I think I came across a book. I think it might have won a few awards, actually. It's called The Essex Serpents. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Have you read it?
I haven't. I know what happens in it, though.
Yeah, I think that's based on a folk tale, isn't it, from Essex?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems to be quite popular now to implement these or adapt these tales into our own stories, because they are great stories. Like when you were explaining about the lantern worm before, that I was hooked. So it just goes to show, doesn't it, that they are a man to to be tapped into for fantasy writers. And yeah, it's been fascinating chatting more about it today. So thanks very much to Lucy and Janina for joining us again. And we've got another instalment, haven't we, yet to come, looking at Greek mythology, which is my personal favourite of all the mythologies. Yeah, so we'll look forward to that conversation. How can we find out a bit more about you two in the Fae Fellows podcast?
So we're on Facebook, Instagram and Tumblr as @Fae Fellows Podcast and as Fae Fellows on Twitter. Feel free to message us, comment on things, and give us ideas for new episodes. If you'd like to hear about anything in particular, we're happy to incorporate that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time. A massive thank you to Lucy and Janina for sharing their insights. We'll be welcoming them back next time for a chat about Greek mythology, which is one of my absolute favourites. So be sure to subscribe and follow, and join our mailing list too, so you don't miss that episode. In that episode, which comes out on the 28th of December, we'll be looking at evolution and world building too. Of course, I'll have some calls for submissions and some writing news and tips as well. So that's it now from us before Christmas. I wish you a truly wonderful festive season, and I hope you get plenty of time off work to relax and enjoy time with friends and family, and to do whatever you love to do most, which for me, plenty of writing, plenty of reading, plenty of spending time with the people I love. Don't forget, if you have any questions or comments or want a shout out in the next episode, just email the fantasywriterstoolshed@gmail.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow and share the show with anyone you think may enjoy it. We've also got a bunch of awesome things on Patreon too, including fantasy writing classes, fantasy writing books, and you can also find out how to join our writing community there as well. So thank you for listening, happy holidays, and keep on scribbling.